In the garden, Judas approached with a kiss, and soldiers stepped forward with swords and clubs. Jesus was arrested, and from that exact moment forward, through his trial, his crucifixion, and every single one of his resurrection appearances, Jesus never spoke Judas's name again. Not once, not a curse, not a final word of judgment, not even a private comment recorded by anyone who was there. The man who had walked with him for 3 years simply vanishes from Jesus' own recorded speech, completely and permanently, at the precise moment most people would expect him to say something. Everyone knows Judas as the disciple who betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, sealing the deal with a kiss in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's one of the most universally recognized acts of treachery in Western storytelling, referenced constantly even by people with no other knowledge of the Bible at all. But almost no retelling of this story pauses on a detail that becomes more striking as you longer you sit with it. After that kiss, Jesus is recorded speaking a great deal, to Pilate, to the crowds, to the women weeping for him, to the criminals crucified beside him, to his own mother, to his grieving disciples after the resurrection. And in none of those recorded conversations does he ever bring up Judas again. Most tellings of this story treat the kiss in the garden as the final, defining moment of the relationship between these two men, the dramatic conclusion of a 3-year friendship turned betrayal. What almost no one mentions is that the actual final word from Jesus' own mouth came earlier, at the table, and that everything after the kiss is total, unbroken silence on the subject for the rest of the Gospel accounts. This is exactly the kind of overlooked detail Untold Bible Stories exists to slow down for. Stay with me, because this silence turns out to say something Jesus' own words never could have. To understand how unusual this silence actually is, it helps to look closely at everything Jesus did say about Judas before the betrayal happened, because the contrast between before and after is where the real strangeness of this story lives. At the Last Supper, seated with all 12 disciples for what would be their final meal together, reclining around a low table in the manner of that culture, Jesus grew troubled in spirit and said plainly, "Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." The disciples, we're told, looked at one. Another, uncertain of whom he meant, and began to ask him, one after another, in a rising wave of confusion and distress around the table, "Is it I, Lord?" This alone is worth pausing on. None of them apparently suspected Judas specifically, out of a group of 12 men who had lived and traveled together for years. Whatever Judas had been doing to arrange his betrayal with the chief priests, he had done it quietly enough that his closest companions, men who had eaten, traveled, and ministered alongside him for years, had no idea he was capable of what he was already in the process of doing. And each of them, in that moment, seemed genuinely more willing to suspect himself than to suspect Judas by name. Jesus did not announce Judas's name publicly at that table, even as the questioning continued around him. Instead, according to John's account, the disciple whom Jesus loved, reclining close enough to lean back against Jesus during the meal, asked quietly who the betrayer was, and Jesus answered just as quietly, in a manner apparently audible only to the two of them. "It is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it." He dipped the bread and gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. This was an intimate gesture in that culture, not a public accusation. Offering a piece of bread to a specific guest was in some contexts actually a mark of honor or favor at a shared table, making the moment even stranger in retrospect, an act of hospitality extended in the very same breath as its recipient's exposure. And then Jesus said something that has troubled readers for centuries. What you are going to do quickly. This is the last direct thing Jesus is recorded saying to Judas specifically before the events of that night carried them both toward the garden. Not a plea to reconsider, not a warning about consequences, though Jesus had already said elsewhere at that same table that it would have been better for that man if he had not been born, a warning delivered generally to the group rather than directly to Judas by name. Not an argument or an appeal to whatever relationship the two of them still had after 3 years together, after Judas had presumably witnessed the same miracles, heard the same teaching, and received the same commission to preach and heal that the other 11 disciples had also received. A simple, almost businesslike instruction to proceed with what Judas had already decided to do. Judas, then, went out immediately, and Scripture adds a small, haunting detail. It was night, a phrase many readers across the centuries have taken as carrying weight beyond the merely literal, darkness settling over the moment in more than one sense. The other disciples at the table, we're told, still had no idea why Jesus said this to Judas. Some supposed that since Judas kept the money bag, serving as a kind of treasurer for the group's shared resources, Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the feast or to give something to the poor. Ordinary, unremarkable explanations for an ordinary member of their group stepping out during a meal. Evidence of just how completely Judas's true intentions had remained hidden from everyone at that table except Jesus himself. The full weight of what had just happened at that table was apparently invisible to everyone present except Jesus and, presumably, Judas himself, who alone among the 12 understood exactly what those words meant and where the rest of his night would actually lead. Hours later, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas arrived leading a crowd armed with swords and clubs sent by the chief priests and elders. He had arranged a signal in advance. Whoever he kissed was the one they should arrest. He approached Jesus directly and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Matthew's Gospel records Jesus' response in a single line, "Friend, do what you came to do." Luke's account adds a different detail, with Jesus asking, "Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" Whichever exact words were spoken in that moment, they represent the very last words Jesus is recorded directing at Judas personally, ever in any of the 4 Gospels. From this point forward, the Gospels continue for chapters. An arrest, an interrogation before the high priest, a trial before Pilate, a brutal flogging, a march to Golgotha, a crucifixion, 3 days in a tomb, and then a resurrection followed by multiple recorded appearances to grieving, confused disciples. Jesus speaks throughout nearly all of it. He answers Pilate's questions. He tells the women of Jerusalem not to weep for him, but for themselves and their children. He promises one of the criminals crucified beside him that today he will be with him in paradise. He speaks tenderly to his mother from the cross, entrusting her care to the disciple John. After the resurrection, he speaks at length to Mary Magdalene in the garden, to 2 travelers on the road to Emmaus, to Thomas doubting in the upper room, to Peter on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in a conversation specifically designed to restore him after his own failure of denying Jesus 3 times. Jesus, in other words, remains an active, speaking presence throughout every subsequent chapter of these final events, addressing enemies, strangers, and his own failed and frightened followers alike. And through every single one of these conversations, across every gospel, Judas's name never comes up again from Jesus' own mouth. Not in anger, not in grief, not even in the extended, deeply personal restoration conversation Jesus has with Peter after his own betrayal by denial, a conversation that would have offered an obvious, natural opening to mention Judas's far more severe betrayal by comparison, and yet doesn't. Peter gets 3 chances to reaffirm his love for Jesus, mirroring his 3 denials in one of the most tender passages in all 4 Gospels. Judas gets nothing. No parallel scene. No mention at all. While Jesus' silence continued through the rest of the Gospel narrative, Judas's own story reaches its end in a passage most retellings compress into a single, grim sentence. Matthew's Gospel records that when Judas saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." Notice the specific word choice here, innocent blood, an admission that goes beyond simple regret over a business arrangement gone wrong, suggesting Judas himself, in his final hours, no longer harbored any illusion about what exactly he had participated in, or about the true character of the man he had handed over for a price. The religious leaders, unmoved by his confession, told him that was his own concern, not theirs. offering no comfort, no absolution, no acknowledgment of any kind for a man who had just handed them the very person they wanted dead, dismissing his anguish as coldly and efficiently as they had once negotiated the price of his betrayal. Judas threw the silver into the temple and departed, and went and hanged himself. The chief priests, unwilling to put blood money back into the temple treasury since it was considered unlawful to do so, used it instead to buy a field to bury foreigners in, a field that came to be called the Field of Blood, a name that endured, according to Matthew, to the very day he was writing. Notice what's missing from even this account of Judas's final hours: any recorded word from Jesus about it. Jesus was, at this point in the timeline, already before Pilate, already moving toward his own crucifixion, already absorbing the weight of an unjust trial and a brutal flogging, and there is no indication in any gospel that word of Judas's suicide ever reached him, or that he commented on it if it did. The two men's stories, so tightly interwoven for 3 years of shared ministry, end at almost exactly the same historical moment, one dying by his own hand in a field bought with betrayal money, the other dying on a cross only hours or days later, without a single further word passing between them, even indirectly, even secondhand through any of the other disciples who might have carried word of one man's death to the other. A man spends 3 years walking beside Jesus, sharing meals, watching miracles, receiving the same teaching and the same trust as the other 11 disciples, and then simply disappears from Jesus' own recorded speech at the exact moment betrayal becomes reality. No final judgment spoken aloud. No last word of anger or heartbreak preserved for us to read. Subscribe to Untold Bible Stories, because what this silence might actually mean, and how the early church chose to talk about Judas once Jesus himself never would again, is the part of this story almost no retelling stops to ask about at all. It's worth noting that Jesus' silence about Judas did not mean Judas was simply forgotten by everyone else once the gospel narratives themselves came to a close. In the opening chapter of Acts, in the days following the Ascension, with roughly 120 believers gathered together awaiting what would come next, Peter stands up among them and addresses Judas's fate directly, quoting from the Psalms to explain why a replacement needed to be chosen to restore the number of the apostles to 12. Peter describes Judas as one who was numbered among the apostles and had a share in this ministry, language that acknowledges, even in the middle of explaining his downfall, that Judas's place among the original 12 had been real and genuine, not some kind of counterfeit inclusion from the very beginning, not a role Judas had somehow faked or been excluded from in substance, even as his heart moved toward betrayal. Peter goes on to describe, in brief and somewhat gruesome detail, what became of the field purchased with the betrayal money, and quotes scripture calling for someone else to take his position of overseer. The believers then put forward 2 candidates and cast lots between them, an ancient method of decision-making that leaves the final choice explicitly outside of human preference or campaigning, and Matthias was added to the 11 remaining apostles, quietly restoring the number without further comment on Judas himself beyond what Peter had already said in that single address. This is one of the only places anywhere in the New Testament where a disciple directly addresses what happened to Judas at any length, and even here, the tone is closer to solemn, practical explanation than condemnation or emotional reflection. Peter's speech functions almost like an administrative necessity, explaining why a vacancy exists and how it will be filled, rather than an extended meditation on betrayal or loss, rather than a eulogy or a denunciation delivered with any real emotional weight attached to it. The raw, personal grief or anger a modern audience might expect from Jesus' closest followers, discussing the man who had just handed their leader over to be crucified, simply isn't recorded anywhere in the text, from Jesus or from anyone else close to him, an absence that runs consistently through every layer of the New Testament's own telling of this story. There are a few different ways theologians and readers across the centuries have tried to make sense of this near-total silence, and it's worth walking through the most common explanations rather than settling on just one, since Scripture itself never explains its own silence directly, leaving generations of readers to reason toward their own conclusions instead. Some have suggested that Jesus' lack of further comment about Judas reflects a kind of settled, sorrowful acceptance rather than active anger, that everything meaningful Jesus had to say to Judas had already been said at the table, in that quiet offering of bread, and the instruction to do quickly what he had already decided to do, and that repeating or expanding on that after the betrayal had actually occurred would have added nothing beyond what had already been communicated in that private moment, since Jesus had, by his own account earlier at the table, already known exactly what Judas intended to do before he ever left the room. Others point to the intense physical and emotional weight of everything Jesus was enduring in these final hours. An unjust trial before religious leaders determined to see him dead, physical torture at the hands of Roman soldiers, the crushing weight of carrying his own means of execution, and finally the crucifixion itself, and suggests that his attention and his recorded words were simply, understandably, focused elsewhere on his mother's care, on the criminal beside him seeking assurance in his final moments, on completing what he had come to do, rather than on revisiting a betrayal that had already run its course and could no longer be undone by anything he said about it now, regardless of how much emotional weight it may have still carried privately. Still, others read the silence theologically as consistent with a broader pattern found throughout Jesus' ministry of refusing to publicly shame or condemn even those who had wronged him most severely, extending instead a kind of restraint that leaves final judgment to God rather than pronouncing it himself in the moment, a pattern visible elsewhere in his treatment of those who mocked, arrested, and eventually executed him. This reading finds some support in the words Luke records Jesus praying from the cross itself, extended broadly to those responsible for his crucifixion. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." A prayer that, notably, doesn't exclude Judas by name, even though it doesn't specifically include him either, leaving its exact scope as one more piece of this story that Scripture declines to fully resolve. Whatever the true explanation, and Scripture itself never settles on just one, the silence remains one of the more striking and under-discussed features of the entire Passion narrative. A relationship that had spanned 3 years of shared ministry, shared meals, and shared trust ends not with a final confrontation, not with Jesus' own verdict spoken aloud for history to record, but with a single instruction to act quickly, followed by nothing at all, an absence that speaks, in its own way, just as loudly as any recorded condemnation might have. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the most famous betrayal in human history produced, from the person actually betrayed, no recorded final word of anger, no public denunciation, no lingering commentary of any kind, despite every opportunity and every reasonable justification to offer one. Every other major figure in the Passion narrative, Pilate, the crowds, the religious leaders, even the disciples who fled, in fear and later returned in shame, receives some form of direct engagement from Jesus, questions asked, answers given, forgiveness extended or withheld through his actions and his words alike. Judas alone receives total silence after the moment of betrayal itself, a silence that has left readers filling in the gap with their own interpretations for roughly 2,000 years since, unable to settle definitively on what exactly that silence was meant to communicate, if anything at all, beyond its own simple, unresolved presence in the text. Whatever else can be said about it, the silence itself has become, in its own strange way, one of the most quietly powerful details in the entire Passion story, not because of what it explicitly reveals, but because of how much interpretive weight it has been asked to carry across centuries of readers looking for an answer the Gospels themselves never quite give. If you've ever experienced a relationship that simply ended without a final conversation, without the confrontation or the closure you might have expected or even wanted, Jesus' silence toward Judas offers something worth considering, that not every ending requires a final word to be complete, and that some of the most significant things a person can communicate happen not in what gets said afterward, but in what was already said before the ending arrived at all. If you want the parts of these stories other channels never slow down enough to tell, subscribe to Untold Bible Stories. A new story like this one every week. And next time, we're staying with a man who lost everything he owned in a single day and never once heard the reason why.